The year is 2031. Flesh Giant now costs 99 mana. It's still played on turn 2. Yeah, so Flesh Giant kept getting nerfed, right? Is it gonna get nerfed again? It turns out we got some news again a couple days ago when you're watching this that we've got buffs and nerfs coming, and indeed wild format looks like it will be addressed as a part of those nerfs. You can see that here with Alec Dawson's tweet. Still planning this schedule. Previous changes were an addendum. Now we're going to have a patch that's created specifically for balance changes, and they're talking about many things, nerfs and buffs, and the approach to wild is an act in extreme cases. Current case is probably clearing that bar. So not 100% that we're going to get some changes to wild, but pretty likely. And there's been a lot of outcry from the wild community and a weird amount of hate directed back at the wild community lately. So hopefully this helps ease some of the problems wild has been facing, while also still shaking up the standard format meta once again, maybe bringing some new stuff to life with buffs, and of course keeping other things, power levels, in check, and maybe just shuffling decks around by popularity can really help the game still feel fresh. So as always, since we got a tease here for nerfs and buffs, I thought I'd make a video talking through some of the things I think we might see. 99 mana Flesh Giants, probably not on that list, but I'm sure some people would like to push it to that point. Yeah, so let's talk about what the nerfs might be instead. And we've already done this a little bit for Warlock, but we're going to rehash it. I'm going to bump the numbers up even further. What if the Demon Seed went to 8, 9, and 10 damage instead of the current 6, 7, and 8, really helping to slow down Warlock in wild format? I mean, I still think this would give this deck that same terminal win condition. Like, they would still be able to beat a lot of stuff just because they have inevitability through the damage output. Slowing down when they complete it just demands they have a little bit more survivability along the way, or take some extra risks along the way. I think that'd be fine because the deck just wins when it gets to that point. Clearly the win rate would go down, the popularity would decrease, but it seems like people really, really hate playing against this style, or at least a vast majority of people. So, I think people who really enjoy this would still be able to do it and would still be able to find some success and win games, but it would become less meta relevant, more fringe. So retaining that playability, but, reducing the oppressiveness that this card seems to bring. So far, Blizzard's been reluctant to nerf the Demon Seed. They seem like they've been going after other cards in Warlock instead, but it might be time to just finally bite the bullet, or bite the seed in this particular case. Another change for Warlock I've talked about before that I think would help is pushing Backfire to 4 mana. This one's still being played in Wild, still in the most popular versions of Quest Warlock in standard format, which are the more handlock style versions. And of course, what does handlock need? Handlock needs lots of card draws. If you're going to dump cheap Goldshire Knolls, you're going to advance your quest, if you're going to push towards your empty deck cards like Baron Scavenger, this card fuels all of those things. So slowing it down by a mana makes this deck again have to take some lower tempo turns, particularly key turns like mid-game turns like turn 4, where your opponent's really starting to push some heat. If that slows them down a lot and it disrupts other options, it helps handle the Warlock problem. So what about another Warlock card option? And by the way, I'm not saying all 3 of these cards should be nerfed or anything. I don't want to totally kill a deck or class, just that these are options I think Blizzard could probably consider that would help address some of the problems out there. Now, Raised Dead's a bit of an interesting one because it hurts 2 decks simultaneously. It is a dual class card. So this would both affect Warlock and its various quest shenanigans, but it would also actually affect aggro Shadow Priest, Face Priest as I like to call it, which utilizes this to get some crazy high value minions like Void Touched Attendant to just push a ton of extra damage, giving you a lot of consistency on those early game plays. So, if you start nerfing Warlock and nerfing other decks, I think Priest is one of those decks that stands to gain the most. It's still really good, has a very directed game plan. If you don't also hurt Priest in the process, it feels like that could be the next big problem people start hating on. So a nerf to Raised Dead could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, essentially, limiting both decks a little. Again, not the goal to kill them, pushing it to 1 though, just slows them down, makes them spend some tempo if they want to get the value back here from Raised Dad. And of course, getting 2 minions for 0 mana is insanely affordable. And both of these decks don't care about taking the damage. Warlock, of course, actually loves taking the damage. So there's really no downside at all. This card is just hyper efficient. Now, I will admit pushing it to 1 introduces some kind of secondary problems. There's Tamsin in Warlock, which could suddenly copy this via her effect, because remember, her effect is limited to 1 mana or higher cards. There's also like Wand Maker, maybe give some extra consistency here. So I thought about maybe saying, what if you push this to 2? Would 2 still be reasonable? 2 mana, draw 2 cards isn't terrible. Then Warlock would still love taking the damage. So it's not crazy if you're worried about Tamsin. I don't know how big of a problem that is. I think on average, just slowing it down would help. So maybe not the most elegant fix, but certainly a possibility that I think solves 2 potential problems. So next up here, what if we took a look at Lightning Bloom? We've got Quest Shaman becoming a really, really popular deck in standard format right now. And frankly, Lightning Bloom, I feel like, has just caused a ton of problems throughout its lifespan. Cheating this much mana is absurd. And now in Quest Shaman, not only are they cheating the mana, they're rarely paying the overload cost because they're using Quest to clean off the overload aspect here. So it's just really accelerating a ton of mana with no downside. So a lot of people have said, how do you nerf Lightning Bloom? It's a really hard card to nerf. Like pushing it to 1 mana feels weird. Changing the overload probably doesn't help because they're still accelerating that mana when it matters. I've always said, what if we just use refresh the mana crystals instead of gain the mana crystals? In other words, if you're at 2 mana, you can't use this to push to 4 and cheat out a bigger play, but you can still use it to gain 2 mana in any given turn. So basically make it like a reverse mana biscuit for Mage. They pay the 2 mana up front, and then they have the ability to gain that 2 mana back at a future turn. Lightning Bloom, you would be able to gain the mana back now and then pay that 2 mana later via overload. So, it'd be harder to get like a Canal Slogger out or line up those perfect overload clearing turns with the quest, because you can't use higher cost stuff like 3 drops on turn 2. You'd have to play like 2 2-drops instead, which might really limit options and make things more awkward. But as you moved into the mid to late game, this would retain often as much efficiency as it did before, allowing you to increase the total mana expenditure, just not the, acceleration of cards sooner than they would normally otherwise be played. So to me, this feels like a clean change for a card that to me has been problematic for a while and, still remains problematic in Hearthstone standard meta today as well. All right, so next up, I want to talk about some buffs. Alec teased that some buffs are planned. I don't know how many, but I got a few ideas here. Certainly could be a lot more. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, what cards you'd like to see buffed. Share those down in the comments there. But Pirate Warrior, Quest Warrior seems like a really cool deck idea. And, shifting pirates more towards mid-range stuff. I love the Juggernaut and the idea of that just overwhelming opponents over a long period of time. But it just doesn't quite get there yet. Now, of course, if other things get nerfed, it might naturally gain some ground, but I think it could still use a little help. And of course, I wanted to buff the Juggernaut. I wanted to buff Rokara, the quest line, some way or another. Maybe just make the Juggernaut end of turn instead of start of turn. Maybe just make it deal 6 damage instead of 4. Whatever. Make it equip a weapon that costs 3 or more, so you don't low roll the weapon. Some kind of fix like that could go a long way. And I looked, and it's good in wild. It's being played in wild, so I didn't want to make wild suffer for the sake of standard. So I said, well, maybe we shouldn't buff the quest line then. Maybe an accessory card like Cargo Guard should be buffed. What if we just made this thing a 3/4 so that it still retains some aggressiveness? Which mid-range decks still value. They want to be able to pressure a little bit. Takes better trades on board, and still gives you that same armor gain. So it's kind of a perfect fit as you transition into the mid game for something like a Questline Warrior deck. I don't know if this would be enough of a change, of course, to really make that deck good, but maybe a change like this here and there could add up to be enough. Now, that said, it was teased on Twitter from Ixar that they are actually looking at the Questline for Warrior and might buff the Questline. So that's great for standard, maybe a little bit concerning for wild, depending on how that shakes out. I don't know enough about how that deck plays, if that would make a huge difference or not, but I just know the card's being run for some reason. So buffing it could be an issue over in that other format. So either way, some kind of Pirate Warrior buff would be a welcome sight, I think, which, my God, I never thought I'd say those words. All right, so next up's our buddy Sheldras here. What if we gave this guy taunt and bumped his stats up a little bit? He's so hard to play right now for 8 mana. Just 8 mana cards just don't get played. Particularly this one, like, if you have that immediate draw for him, like, yeah, he can do some cool stuff. But that often requires even more mana. So you're playing this thing so late in the game. It's so hard to just plop it down. Give it taunt so that it has at least a little bit of interaction on board so your opponent just can't ignore it and go face and end the game. Bump the stats up so it's a little bit more awkward to deal with. I think both of those would really help. I don't even know if this is enough. You could arguably make this like 7/7. That feels too good, but as slow as it is compared to modern day Hearthstone, I don't actually think it would be at all. But I just want this card to give some stabilization when you play it, to give it a little bit of extra window to actually pull off the castle and drawn cards. You don't want to make a card like this too good. It might feel terrible, but it's so late in the game. I don't care if it swings pretty hard. I think that'd be totally fine. All right, so this next one's kind of a risky one, but what if we made Seek Guidance a little quicker to complete? What if you only had to do 2 cards per step? So, first step is 2 and 3. Second step is 4 and 5. Third step is 6 and 7. Basically removing the 8 cost requirement, which changes deck building. You can play a faster deck. Also just requires less total turns and would get you to the Purified Shard much faster. I don't know if I love that. This is the kind of thing where if it's too good, it's probably going to be something people end up hating because they feel like they can't really win the game. It's just going to win automatically at some point. But right now, this one's just really, really hard to get to work. There's like a couple decks out there that seem good and really talented players' hands, but actually aren't really all that great when you look at stats. So I don't know. It's an idea. I like the idea of quest lines having at least a little bit of viability. I still think it ended up being too slow to be really meta relevant, even with this change. But what do you guys think? Would this be good or bad? And should this card even be touched or just condemned to failure forever? And then finally, my last buff recommendation here. What if we made the Rat King 4 mana? I think I'm cool with it. Like, there's a lot of competition at 5 mana in Hunter right now. I don't think this would become crazy oppressive. I lowered the stat values here too to make it feel Yeti-esque. 5/5 with all this upside seemed a little ridiculous for 4 mana. 4/5 kind of does too, but I actually still don't think this card would be broken at this rate. Ultimately, it takes a while to get it spinning, right? It's like 5 minions have to die, and that can take some work. That could take a couple turns sometimes to get off. And to really get excessive value out of this guy, right, games have to stretch on for 5-6 turns. So I don't think getting it down a turn earlier would really change that much, but it would help you get into this engine and get into this game plan a little bit faster while still retaining some annoyance and some threat on board. This does lose a little bit of flavor with all the other rat cards, the extraordinary sized rats or whatever that are all 5/5s and stuff. Like, he would feel weird as a 4/5 in some ways, but sometimes you got to give up flavor for the sake of a card being played, because it's not very flavorful if it's not played. And this one's really only in fringe decks, no meta decks for real. Utilize the Rat King. But a lot of people love the idea of this card, as do I, so I'd love for it to get a little bump and see some play. That said, I think that's it here for our buffs and nerfs. Which of these do you think are great ideas, and which ones do you think are terrible ideas? What do you want to see from the Blizzard team here when it comes to nerfs and buffs? I'm certainly not saying any of these are perfect ideas, just things that came to mind and really just generated discussion more than anything else. I just like having fun stuff to talk about. So curious to hear your takes. Where would you go with these nerfs and buffs? Share those thoughts down below. Thanks much, as always, for watching. And until next time, game on.